Thomas Miller never imagined he'd be sheltering a being from another world in his tool shed, much less that this being would reveal truths about who's really pulling humanity's strings that would forever change his understanding of reality. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. Tom, as everyone called him, was a 61-year-old retired mechanic, divorced for 9 years, living alone on a modest property on the outskirts of Laramie, Wyoming. His life seemed ordinary: predictable routine, stable retirement, occasional visits from his daughter Sarah, who lived in Casper. Nothing to suggest he was about to discover secrets most people would never know. The story began on a Friday night when Tom was driving home after visiting Sarah in Casper. She had just given birth to her first child, making Tom a grandfather for the first time. The visit had been good, but it had left Tom thoughtful during the entire drive back. It was almost 2:00 inches the morning when he decided to take a detour down a secondary road that cut through open fields. He liked this route. Less traffic, nice scenery even at night. Time to drive in peace. Snow had started falling lightly, creating a thin, gleaming layer over the field, stretching beyond the road. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the landscape with a silvery, ethereal light. Tom had the radio off, enjoying the silence of the night. That's when he saw the lights. At first, he thought they were headlights from some distant vehicle, maybe a tractor working late in the fields. But the lights were strange, too bright, with a bluish quality unlike conventional vehicle lighting, and they were moving erratically, rising and falling, spinning in patterns no earthbound vehicle could make. Tom slowed down instinctively, his eyes fixed on the lights that now seemed to be descending rapidly toward an open field, about 400 yards to the right of the road. For a moment, the lights intensified so much he had to shield his eyes. And then darkness. The lights simply disappeared, as if someone had flipped a giant switch. Tom stopped the car on the shoulder, his heart pounding. His rational mind immediately began offering explanations. Military helicopter with problems, some kind of experimental drone, maybe even late New Year's fireworks. But none of these explanations seemed adequate for what he just witnessed. He sat in the car for several minutes debating with himself. The sensible thing would be to move on, go home, maybe call the authorities if he thought there'd been an accident. But curiosity and something more, maybe instinct, maybe intuition, was pulling Tom toward that field. Tom grabbed the flashlight he always kept in the glove compartment, put on his thick winter coat, and got out of the car. The air was freezing, his breath forming vapor clouds as he walked toward the field where the lights had disappeared. The freshly fallen snow muffled his steps as he crossed the low fence and walked across the open field. By the light of the moon and his flashlight, Tom could see strange marks in the snow. Not footprints, but something more like a trail from something that had been dragged, accompanied by areas where the snow had melted completely, leaving circles of exposed earth steaming in the night cold. Following the trail, Tom noticed an orange glow ahead. As he approached, he realized it was debris, fragments of something that definitely wasn't conventional human technology. The material had a strange quality, almost organic, but also metallic, glowing with its own light, even as it smoked and cooled in the snow. "What the hell?" Tom murmured, crouching to examine the fragments more closely. The material was unlike anything he'd seen in his 42 years working with metals and machines. And then he heard the sound. It was low, almost inaudible, something between a moan and a hum. Tom stood quickly and pointed the flashlight toward the sound. Behind a larger cluster of debris, something was moving. Tom approached slowly, his mechanic's instinct overriding natural fear. If something or someone was injured, they needed help. But when he rounded the debris and his flashlight fully illuminated the figure, his brain took several seconds to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a humanoid shape, but clearly not human. Taller and thinner than any person Tom had ever seen, with slightly different proportions, longer limbs, narrower torso. The skin had a tone that shifted subtly under the flashlight, as if reflecting colors that didn't exist in the normal spectrum, and it was injured. One of its long arms was pressed against what Tom assumed was the equivalent of a chest, where some kind of luminescent fluid was leaking, staining the snow around it with a blue-green glow. The being tried to back away when Tom's light hit it. Its eyes, large, dark, expressive in a way that transcended language, showing something Tom immediately recognized as fear. "Hey, hey," Tom said softly, raising one hand in a universal gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're injured. You need help." The being remained still, clearly assessing whether Tom represented a threat. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. A retired Wyoming mechanic and a visitor from another world, both equally surprised by this impossible encounter. And then the being did something Tom would never forget. It slowly extended its free hand toward Tom, not in a gesture of attack, but of acceptance, of trust. Tom couldn't explain why he did what he did next. Maybe it was compassion, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something deeper, a feeling that this moment was somehow meant to be. "My car is over there," Tom said, gesturing toward the road. "My house is 20 minutes from here. I've got a shed where you can stay. I can try to help with that wound." The being tilted its head slightly, as if understanding, not the words perhaps, but the intention behind them. And so began one of the most extraordinary experiences of Thomas Miller's life, an experience that would reveal truths about manipulation, control, and true human potential that would forever change his understanding of the world. In that moment, he didn't know he was about to discover who's really in control of humanity and why. To fully understand why the encounter with that being had such an impact on Tom, you need to know the state he was in during those days. On the outside, his life seemed stable. Decent retirement, own home, acceptable health for his 61 years. But inside, Tom was dealing with a deep frustration that had been growing silently for years. He felt like a failure, and he couldn't understand why. Tom had done everything right, or so he thought. He'd worked hard his whole life, 42 years as a mechanic, often working overtime, weekends, always pushing himself. He married Martha young. They had a daughter, bought a house. He followed all the rules they said led to success and happiness. But somehow, it was never enough. The divorce from Martha 9 years earlier had left a scar Tom still didn't fully understand. They didn't fight much. There was no cheating or drama. They just fell apart. Martha said she was tired, that life had become just work and bills in an endless routine that sucked away whatever joy they once had. "It's not your fault, Tom," she'd said when they finally decided to separate. "But I can't keep living like this either. It feels like we've spent our whole lives running and never getting anywhere." Tom had been hurt and confused. He worked so hard precisely to give his family a good life. But Martha was right. No matter how hard he worked, it always seemed like they were one step behind some financial crisis. Car repair, roof problem, unexpected medical bill, always something draining their savings before they could build any real security. After the divorce, Tom found himself alone for the first time in decades, and the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. At 54, after 42 years of work, he had a modest house with a mortgage still unpaid, some savings that barely covered emergencies, and a growing collection of prescription medications. Where did I go wrong? Tom constantly asked himself. Why did I work so hard and have so little? He saw colleagues in the same situation, people who'd worked their whole lives, always paying bills on time, always doing what was right, and still reaching retirement, worried about money, dependent on systems that seemed increasingly fragile. Tom looked at his daughter Sarah and saw the same pattern repeating, only worse. She'd graduated from college, something Tom and Martha had saved and sacrificed to help pay for. But Sarah still came out with a massive student loan debt she was still paying 10 years later. Sarah got a good job, married Robert, who also had a good job, and they just had a baby. On the surface, they were doing everything right. But during the recent visit, Tom had seen the same exhaustion in his daughter's eyes that he saw in the mirror every day. They worked 60, 70 hours a week, barely saw the baby awake during the week. They were buried in debt, student loans, credit cards, medical loans from the birth, and Sarah was pregnant again, an unplanned pregnancy that terrified her. "Dad, I don't know how we're going to make it," she'd confided during the visit, tears in her eyes. "We work so hard, and it feels like every month we're deeper in the hole. How did you and Mom manage?" The painful truth was that Tom and Martha hadn't managed. They'd slowly drowned on the same treadmill until the marriage collapsed under the weight of constant stress. "That's just how life is," Tom had responded, but the words sounded hollow even to him. You do the best you can. But driving home that night, Tom couldn't stop thinking. Why did it have to be this way? Why wasn't working hard your whole life enough to have basic security and peace of mind? What was wrong with him, or with the world, that made it so hard to simply leave? Tom's financial situation was a constant point of anxiety. The retirement was enough to survive, but barely that. He did some extra work when he could. Mechanical repairs for neighbors, small projects. But at 61, his body didn't have the same stamina anymore. And then there was health. Tom had been on blood pressure medication for years. Then came cholesterol meds, then for acid reflux, then for arthritis. Each doctor's visit seemed to result in new prescriptions, and each prescription drained more money from an already tight budget. You need to take care of your health, Tom, his doctor always said. These medications are essential. But Tom never felt truly well, just medicated, and the medical bills kept coming, even with insurance. An appointment here, a test there, medications every month. It never ended. He found himself thinking about friends who'd died of heart attacks, strokes, cancer, men who'd worked hard their whole lives, done everything right, and died a few years after retirement. What was the point of it all? Tom watched TV at night because he didn't know what else to do with his time. The news always left him depressed. Wars, disasters, bad economy, politicians fighting. He'd switched to some entertainment show, but everything felt empty, designed to make you forget your problems for an hour before returning to depressing reality. He tried hobbies, fishing for a while, but got bored. Tried joining a church group, but didn't connect with anyone. Tried gardening, but his enthusiasm lasted only a few weeks before disappearing. The loneliness was constant. Martha had moved on. Apparently, was happy with someone new. Sarah was too busy with her own life, struggling to survive. Old friends were equally overwhelmed with their own problems. Tom frequently wondered, is this it? I worked 42 years to get here, alone, broke, taking a handful of pills, watching TV at night, and waiting for what? More of the same until I die. There was no specific anger, no clear target for his frustration, just a diffuse, persistent feeling that he'd been cheated somehow, that the promise, work hard, follow the rules, and you'll have a good life, hadn't materialized. Or maybe he just wasn't good enough, smart enough, hardworking enough. Maybe the problem is me, Tom thought on sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling. Maybe I made the wrong choices. Maybe if I'd studied more, changed careers, invested better. But then he looked around and saw that almost everyone he knew was in the same situation, working hard, having little, constantly worried, waiting for some break that never really came. Why is it so hard, was the question that wouldn't leave his mind. Not directed at anyone specific, just at the universe in general. Why is living so hard? Tom had no answers, no theory about why. He didn't blame anyone specifically. He just felt a constant weight, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, a sense of being trapped in a life that wasn't supposed to be like this. But he didn't know how it could be different. It was in this state, frustrated, tired, feeling like a failure, but not understanding why. Questioning the purpose of everything, but without clear direction for his questions, that Tom found the being in that snowy field. He didn't know he was about to discover that his struggles weren't personal failures, that there were very specific reasons why life seemed so difficult, and that these reasons had nothing to do with him not being good enough, but rather with systems designed to keep him exactly where he was. But as he carefully drove home that early morning with a being from another world lying in the back seat of his pickup wrapped in a blanket, Tom only hoped he could help this strange, wounded creature. He had no idea that this act of compassion would forever change his understanding of everything. Taking the wounded being home was one of the most impulsive decisions Tom had ever made in his life. He wasn't the type of person who did risky or reckless things. 42 years working with machines and tools had taught him to be cautious, methodical, always thinking about the consequences of each action. But something in that moment, looking at this being clearly in pain, clearly scared, clearly needing help, had triggered an instinct in Tom that was stronger than logic. It was the same instinct that made him stop to help stranded motorists on the road, the same one that made him fix things for free for elderly neighbors who didn't have money. The 20-minute drive to his property was tense. Tom constantly checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see helicopter lights or military vehicles pursuing him. If this really was an alien craft that had crashed, surely someone had detected it. Surely the government or military were on their way. But the roads remained deserted. Just Tom, the snow falling softly, and a visitor from another world moaning quietly in the back seat. When he finally got home, Tom didn't take the being into the main house. Instinctively, he knew he needed to keep it hidden, at least until he better understood the situation. He drove straight to the tool shed at the back of the property, a large structure that had once been a barn, but which Tom had partially converted into a personal mechanics workshop. The shed had basic heating, lighting, a work area with tools, and even an old worn couch that Tom sometimes used to nap when working on long projects. More importantly, it had privacy. The structure wasn't visible from the road, and Tom didn't have neighbors close enough to see him going in and out of the shed at any hour. Helping the being out of the pickup was challenging. It was taller than Tom, maybe 6'3", but surprisingly light, as if its bones were hollow like a bird's. Tom half carried, half supported the creature to the couch, where it lay down with a sigh that sounded universal in its exhaustion. Under the bright light of the shed's lamps, Tom could see the being more clearly. The skin had a tone that was hard to describe. Not exactly gray, not exactly blue, but something in between, with an almost iridescent quality that shifted subtly, depending on the angle of the light. The eyes were large and dark, but not completely black. There was depth to them, layers of color that revealed themselves when you looked more closely. The chest wound was concerning. The luminescent fluid had stopped leaking, but the area around it looked burned or severely bruised. Tom had no idea how to treat an alien wound, but his experience with basic first aid from decades working in shops suggested that at least he needed to clean and protect the area. "Okay, I'm going to get some things," Tom said aloud, speaking more to himself than expecting the being to understand. "Water, clean towels, maybe some antiseptic. I don't know if it'll work on you, but it's the best I can do." The being turned its head toward Tom, its large eyes fixing on his face with an intensity that was simultaneously unsettling and strangely comforting. Then, to Tom's surprise, the being slowly raised a hand, a gesture that clearly meant, "Wait, or it's not necessary." Tom stopped, watching as the being placed its own hand over the wound. The fingers were longer than human ones, with extra joints, and there was a grace to every movement that seemed almost impossible. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft light began to emanate from beneath the being's hand, and Tom could swear he saw the wound beginning to close, alien tissue slowly regenerating before his eyes. "You can heal yourself," Tom murmured, more statement than question. The being kept its hand over the wound for a few more minutes, then let it drop to its side, clearly exhausted from the effort. The wound wasn't completely healed, but looked significantly better. No longer leaking fluid, the skin around it less damaged. Tom pulled up an old work chair and sat near the couch, maintaining a respectful distance. Now that the initial impulse to help had passed, a flood of questions began invading his mind. Practical questions, existential questions, questions he didn't even know he could ask until this moment. "So," Tom began, feeling ridiculous for trying to talk to an alien. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" The being didn't respond verbally, but there was something in its eyes, in the tilt of its head, that suggested some level of understanding. "Do you need water? Food? I have no idea what you eat." But Tom gestured vaguely toward the main house. Again, the being made a subtle gesture with its hand, negative but grateful. It was fascinating how nonverbal communication could transcend completely different species. Tom leaned back in the chair, suddenly feeling completely overwhelmed by the situation. Here he was, a retired Wyoming mechanic, sitting in his tool shed with a being from another world. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, it was happening. "I should call someone," Tom said aloud, more thinking out loud than asking a question. The government, maybe, or scientists, people who would know what to do with this situation. But even as he spoke, Tom knew he wasn't going to do that. Not yet, at least. There was something about the being's vulnerability, about the trust it had placed in Tom by accepting help, that made the idea of turning it over to the authorities deeply wrong. Besides, Tom had watched enough movies and read enough stories to know how governments dealt with aliens. Dissection, experimentation, interrogations. No, he wasn't going to expose this creature to that. Not while it was in his care. "You're going to stay here until you recover," Tom decided. "I'll keep you hidden. I won't tell anyone, at least for now." The being slowly closed its eyes, a gesture Tom interpreted as gratitude, or perhaps just deep exhaustion. Tom spent the next few hours setting up the shed to be more comfortable. He brought extra blankets from the house, a portable heater to supplement the shed's basic heating, bottled water in case the being needed it. He also locked the shed doors and covered the few windows with plywood, ensuring no one could accidentally see inside. Throughout all this, the being remained lying on the couch, occasionally opening its eyes to watch Tom work. There was a meditative quality to its stillness, as if it were resting, but also staying alert for possible threats. When the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Tom finally allowed himself to relax a bit. He sat again in the work chair, watching the being who now seemed to be genuinely sleeping, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that was reassuringly familiar. "What have I done?" Tom murmured to himself. But there was no regret in his voice, just wonder, and a growing sense that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. In the days that followed, Tom established a cautious routine. He woke early as he always did, but instead of his normal routine, he went immediately to the shed to check on the being. He brought food and water, though the being rarely accepted. Apparently, its species needed nutrition much less frequently than humans, or perhaps obtained energy in other ways. The being's wound continued improving visibly each day. The self-healing ability was extraordinary, though clearly draining. The being spent most of its time resting, occasionally getting up to stretch its long limbs or curiously examine some of the tools and equipment in the shed. Tom found himself spending more and more time in the shed, just watching, bringing his morning coffee and sitting in the work chair, studying this impossible creature that had fallen into his life. He tried not to stare, didn't want to be rude or threatening, but it was hard not to be fascinated. He began to notice details. The way the being moved was extremely graceful, each gesture deliberate and efficient. The way it examined objects, turning them in its long hands, touching different textures with what seemed like genuine curiosity. The way its eyes tracked movement, suggesting visual perception much sharper than humans. Tom also started bringing books to the shed. He wasn't sure why, maybe just because he was spending so many hours there that he needed something to do besides watch. He was in the middle of a book on quantum physics he'd picked up from the library weeks before, trying to understand concepts that seemed deliberately designed to confuse ordinary people. It was during one of these reading sessions on the third night since the rescue that something extraordinary happened. Tom was sitting in the chair, book open in his lap, trying to decipher a particularly dense chapter about the nature of consciousness and quantum reality. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice the being get up from the couch and approach silently. Suddenly, a long, slender hand gently touched his. What happened next would forever change Tom's understanding, not just of his extraterrestrial visitor, but of the very nature of human reality and who was really in control. Tom pulled his hand back instinctively, his heart racing. For 3 days, he'd cared for this being with a mixture of compassion and cautious curiosity, but always maintaining a safe, physical distance. Now, with that unexpected touch, a wave of fear swept away all other emotions. "What the hell was I thinking?" flashed through Tom's mind in a surge of panic. "I brought an alien creature onto my property. I don't know anything about it. I don't know if it's dangerous. Don't know what its intentions are. Don't even know if that gesture of asking for help was genuine or some kind of trap." The being immediately stepped back upon sensing Tom's fear, its long hands raising in a universal gesture of non-threat. But there was something different in its eyes now, an intensity, a purpose that Tom hadn't seen before. "Sorry," Tom said, taking a deep breath and trying to calm his racing heart. "You startled me. I don't know what to expect from you." The being remained motionless for a long moment, clearly assessing the situation. Then very slowly, it extended its hand again, but this time keeping it in the air between them, not making contact. It was clearly an invitation, not an imposition. Tom looked at that alien hand extended toward him, Every self-preservation instinct screamed at him to back away, lock the shed from the outside, maybe even call the authorities and let experts deal with this. It's what a sensible person would do. But Tom also saw something in those large, deep eyes. Not threat, not predation, but something that seemed urgent, important, as if the being was trying to communicate that there was something Tom needed to understand, something that justified the risk of that contact. "This is crazy," Tom murmured. But slowly, against all his instincts for caution, he extended his own hand and touched the beings again. What happened next was so far beyond Tom's normal experience that his brain took several seconds to begin processing. The moment of contact was like a door opening in his mind, not painfully, not intrusively, but gently, like curtains being opened to let in sunlight. Suddenly, Tom could hear thoughts that weren't his own. Not words exactly, but concepts, emotions, intentions, transmitted directly into his consciousness. It was telepathic communication, he realized, with a shock of wonder and terror. "Don't be afraid, Thomas," a voice sounded in his mind. Neither masculine nor feminine, neither young nor old, but definitely present. "I won't hurt you." I needed to wait until I was strong enough to make this connection, and you needed to be ready to receive it. Tom opened his mouth to speak, but discovered he could simply think his responses, and they were understood. You're inside my head. We're sharing a temporary mental space," the voice explained. "A bridge between consciousnesses. This is how my species communicates with other forms of intelligent life that don't share our language." This is impossible, Tom thought. But even as he formed the thought, he knew it was pointless. He was experiencing impossibility directly. Telepathy doesn't exist. There's no scientific basis, for there are many things your science hasn't yet discovered, Thomas. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, there are many things that have been discouraged from discovering. That last sentence hung in Tom's mind, loaded with implications he wasn't yet ready to unpack. "How do you know my name?" Tom asked. "I can sense your surface memories through our connection," the voice responded. "Not deeply. I don't invade privacy, but enough to understand basic context. I know you're Thomas Miller, that you rescued me despite having no obligation to do so, that you've been questioning many things about your life and your world." Tom felt a wave of vulnerability. Having something able to access his thoughts was deeply disturbing. "Can you read everything I think?" "Only what you consciously allow yourself to share," the voice assured. "This connection requires consent from both parties. You can end it at any time simply by willing it. But I hope you won't, because there are things you need to know. Answers to questions you've been asking, even without knowing how to articulate them." Tom felt his skepticism fighting against his curiosity. Part of him still screamed that this was dangerous, that he should break contact, put distance between himself and this alien creature. But another part, a part that had been growing for years, the part that questioned and searched and felt that something was fundamentally wrong, was desperate to hear what the being had to say. "Who are you?" Tom thought. "Where do you come from? My name has no equivalent in sounds your species can produce, but you can call me Ilara," the voice responded. "I come from a place very far away, from a system your astronomers haven't yet fully mapped. My species has been observing Earth for a long time, not interfering, just watching." "Why did you crash here?" Tom asked. "Was it an accident?" "My ship was damaged by something unexpected, a form of defense technology that shouldn't exist in this region," Ilara explained. "But perhaps it wasn't completely an accident. Perhaps I needed to be here at this moment to meet you specifically." "Why me?" Tom thought, echoing the question he'd asked himself so many times in recent days. "I'm not special. I'm just a retired mechanic. I don't have education, don't have important resources. You have something much more important," Ilara interrupted gently. "You have questions. You have the capacity to question the reality that's been presented to you as absolute. You feel, even without fully understanding, that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system you live in. That's rarer and more valuable than you imagine." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. How could Ilara know about his frustrations, his silent questionings about why life was so hard? "Because it's not an accident, Thomas," Ilara responded to the unspoken thought. "The difficulty you've experienced isn't your failure. It's not because you didn't work hard enough, weren't smart enough. didn't make the right choices enough. Life on Earth is deliberately designed to be difficult, to keep you struggling, worried, dependent. Designed, Tom thought. By whom? And to fully understand it, you first need to understand something fundamental about your own species, something that's been hidden from you for a long time. Suddenly, through the telepathic connection, Tom began to see images, not with his physical eyes, but directly in his mind. They were visions of Earth, but not as he knew it. It was Earth seen from perspectives he'd never considered, with layers of reality that were normally invisible. He could see energy, currents of something luminous, flowing between people and places, between thoughts and physical matter. It was as if reality itself had an additional dimension that normally wasn't perceptible to human eyes. What am I seeing? Tom thought, fascinated and disturbed. You're seeing reality as it truly is, Illara explained. Energy, consciousness, frequency, all interconnected. Your species used to perceive these layers naturally, but that ability was suppressed over time. The images shifted, now showing people, thousands, millions of them, each emanating a kind of energy field. But Tom noticed something disturbing. Most of these fields were dark, heavy, vibrating at a low frequency that he could somehow feel even through the mental vision. Why do people seem so dense? Tom asked. Because they're operating at a very low frequency of consciousness, Illara responded. Fear, worry, anger, hopelessness. These emotions create dense, heavy vibrations, and when most of the population is vibrating at this low frequency, they become much easier to control. Control, Tom repeated. You keep talking about control. Who's controlling people? Let me show you something. Illara said. The images shifted again. And now Tom saw what he could only describe as lines of influence. Energetic connections flowing not from person to person, but from certain structures to masses of people. He saw these lines emanating from government buildings, from media studios, from corporations, from financial institutions, all converging on populations like invisible webs. Your world is controlled by systems, Illara explained. Not by a single person or group, but by interconnected structures that reinforce themselves. Governments, corporations, media, financial systems, pharmaceutical industry, all operating together, not necessarily through conscious conspiracy, but through aligned incentives. Incentives for what? Tom asked. To keep your species at a low frequency of consciousness, Illara responded. Because people operating at this frequency are predictable, controllable, and profitable. Tom saw images of news broadcasts constantly transmitting fear, disasters, crimes, wars, crises. He saw advertising bombarding people with messages of inadequacy. You're not beautiful enough, young enough, rich enough. He saw financial systems designed to keep people in perpetual debt. He saw medical systems that treated symptoms but never root causes, keeping people dependent on medications for decades. But why? Tom thought, feeling a mixture of horror and recognition. Why would anyone do this deliberately? Power and profit, Illara responded simply. People with fear buy products that promise security. People feeling inadequate buy products that promise to make them feel better. Sick people depend on medical systems. People in debt work jobs they hate. Worried people don't have energy to question the system or develop their inner capacities. Tom felt like something was breaking inside him, not in a negative way, but as if a shell that had been around his perception was cracking, allowing him to see something that had always been there, but he'd never been able to fully focus on. You're telling me that my whole life, all the struggle, all the frustration, all the feeling of never being enough, was deliberately created. It wasn't personal against you, Illara said gently. It was systemic. It affects almost your entire species. But yes, the difficulty you experienced wasn't necessary. It wasn't inevitable. It was the result of living in a system designed to extract energy, time, and resources from you, while keeping you dependent and compliant. Tom felt anger beginning to surface. Not the diffuse, directionless anger he sometimes felt watching the news, but something more focused and hot. And I just accepted it. We all just accept it. We work ourselves to death, worry constantly, and think it's normal. Because you were taught it was normal. Alara responded. Generation after generation, conditioned to accept struggle as inevitable, to see external authorities as sources of truth, to distrust your own perceptions and intuitions. The images continued flowing through Tom's mind, layer upon layer of subtle control, of manipulation so woven into the fabric of society that it had become invisible. And through it all, a growing, urgent question that Tom finally managed to formulate. If all this is true, if we really are being kept in this low-frequency prison, how do we escape? How do we change it? That, Alara responded, and Tom could sense something like hope in the mental voice, is the right question, and the answer will shock you as much as everything I've shown you so far. Because the power to change all of this isn't in governments, isn't in revolutions, isn't in external systems. It's in you, in each individual human. You have abilities that have been hidden from you. Abilities that, if awakened, would make all these control systems completely irrelevant. Tom felt his mind expanding to accommodate this possibility. What kind of abilities? Let me show you, Alara said. And what Tom saw next would forever change his understanding, not just of the world, but of his own nature as a human being. Tom yanked his hand back abruptly, breaking the telepathic contact. The connection severed instantly, leaving him dizzy and disoriented, as if he'd just woken from an extremely vivid dream. No, he said aloud, standing up from the chair so quickly it nearly toppled backward. No, this is crazy. This can't be happening. Alara remained where it was, its long hands returning to its sides, its large eyes watching Tom with what seemed like patient understanding. Tom began pacing back and forth in the shed, his heart pounding, his mind racing. I'm having a nervous breakdown. That has to be it. The stress, the loneliness, the frustration with life. It's all finally caught up with me. And now, I'm having elaborate hallucinations. He looked at Alara, who was still there, as solid and real as anything in the shed. You're probably not even real. I'm probably alone in here talking to myself like a crazy person. But even as he spoke, Tom knew he was lying to himself. Alara was unquestionably real. The telepathic contact had been real. The images he'd seen, the webs of control, the energy frequencies, the interconnected systems of manipulation. It had all been real in a way Tom couldn't deny, no matter how much he wanted to. Even if it is real, Tom continued, his voice rising slightly in panic. Even if you really are an alien and really did show me whatever that was, it doesn't change anything. I can't do anything with this information. I'm just one person. An old, tired man who can barely pay his own bills. Tom stopped pacing and turned to face Alara. And you know what else? Maybe things are the way they are for good reasons. Maybe the world is complicated and systems need to exist to maintain order. Maybe I just don't understand the bigger picture because I'm not smart enough, not educated enough. It was the same justification Tom had used for years to explain his frustrations. The idea that if things were difficult, it must be because he wasn't good enough to make them work. It was easier to blame himself than to consider that maybe the entire system was the problem. I need you to leave, Tom said suddenly. You're better now. Your wound is almost healed. You can go back to your ship or call your people or whatever you need to do, but you can't stay here. Alara didn't move, just continued watching Tom with those immense, unfathomable eyes. Don't you understand? Tom nearly shouted. I don't want to know these things. I don't want to know about control or manipulation or frequencies or whatever. I just want to live my life. Watch TV, go to the grocery store, visit my daughter, live out my remaining years in peace. But, even as he spoke, Tom felt the falseness of his own words because he wasn't at peace. He hadn't been at peace for years, and watching TV wasn't helping. Going to the grocery store wasn't filling the void. Visiting Sarah only showed him she was trapped in the same cycle he'd lived his whole life. Tom dropped back into the chair, suddenly exhausted. I can't handle this, he said more softly. I don't have the energy for it. I don't have anything to offer. He spent several minutes in silence, staring at the concrete floor of the shed, trying to organize his thoughts. Part of him wanted to run, literally leave the shed, maybe even leave town for a few days. Let Alara simply disappear in the same mysterious way it had appeared. Another part wanted to call the authorities. Turn Alara over to people who supposedly knew how to handle this kind of extraordinary situation. Let experts take over. Return to his normal life, however unsatisfying it was. But the biggest part of Tom, the part that kept him awake at night, the part that had been growing stronger in recent years, knew there was no going back. He'd seen too much, understood too much, and more importantly, he'd felt something during that telepathic connection that he couldn't deny. A sense of possibility, of potential, that maybe there was more to life than the endless struggle he'd known. "Why me?" Tom finally asked aloud, looking up to meet Alara's eyes. "If all this is true, if there really is this massive manipulation happening, why show me? What can I do that thousands of smarter and more influential people couldn't do better?" Alara remained silent, but there was something in its posture, in the tilt of its head, that seemed to be waiting for Tom to reach some conclusion on his own. "And even if I believed all this," Tom continued, "even if I accepted that governments and corporations and media are all working together to keep people what? Scared and dependent? Even if I accepted that, what changes? I still have to pay my bills. I still have to eat. I'm still stuck in the same system." Tom stood again and walked to the shed door, looking through a crack in the plywood covering the window. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sky was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. Everything looked normal. His property, the surrounding fields, the distant road, everything exactly as it had always been. "Maybe," Tom said slowly, "maybe you've got the wrong person. Maybe you need someone who's already awake or conscious or whatever you call it. Someone who's already actively questioning these things. Not someone like me who was just complaining about life being hard." But even as he spoke, Tom remembered the sleepless nights, the books he'd tried to read, searching for answers he didn't know how to name, the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Maybe he'd been questioning more than he admitted to himself. Tom turned to look at Alara again. "If I accept what you're showing me," he said carefully, "if I really believe there's this systemic manipulation keeping everyone trapped at a low frequency, or whatever you called it, then what? What am I supposed to do with this information?" Alara finally moved, slowly rising from the couch. It was significantly taller than Tom, and there was a grace to its movements that was almost hypnotic. It extended its hand again, not touching Tom, but offering. Tom looked at that alien hand, knowing that if he accepted it again, if he allowed that telepathic connection to re-establish, there would be no going back. He'd have to confront truths he'd been avoiding his whole life. He'd have to accept that maybe his struggle wasn't personal failure, but the result of systems designed to keep him struggling. "I'm afraid," Tom admitted quietly. "Afraid you're right. Afraid you're wrong. Afraid that even if you're right, I'm not strong enough to do anything about it." Alara kept its hand extended, patient, not pressing. Tom took a deep breath. He thought of Sarah, working 60 hours a week and drowning in debt. He thought of Martha, who'd given up on the marriage because the constant struggle had killed any joy. He thought of himself, 42 years of hard work resulting in a mediocre retirement and a cabinet full of pills. "If I do this," Tom said, "if I accept this connection again and hear the rest of what you have to say, you need to promise me something. You need to show me it's not just theory. You need to show me there's really a way to change things, to live differently. Because I can't. I can't just know I'm trapped without having some hope of escape." For the first time, Tom saw what he could only interpret as a smile across Alara's alien face. Not a movement of lips, exactly, but a subtle shift in expression that conveyed approval and something like affection. Alara tilted its head in a gesture that seemed to mean agreement, promise. Tom looked at that extended hand for one more long moment, and then against all his instinct to protect himself from potentially devastating truth, he extended his own hand and touched Alara again. The telepathic connection re-established instantly, but this time Tom was more prepared. This time, instead of fighting it, he allowed it to flow through him. "Thank you for choosing courage over comfort," Alara's voice sounded in his mind. "Now, let me show you not just what's wrong, but what's possible. Let me show you the true power your species possesses that has been hidden from you for so long." And Tom, finally ready to listen, opened his mind to receive the truths that would change everything. The telepathic connection this time was different, deeper, more stable, as if Tom and Ilara had established a shared frequency that now flowed naturally between them. "What I'm about to show you," Ilara's voice began in his mind, "isn't theory. It's not abstract philosophy. These are real capabilities your species possesses, but which have been systematically suppressed and ridiculed over generations." Through the connection, Tom began seeing images again, but this time they weren't external visions of control systems. They were images of human beings doing things he'd always considered impossible. He saw people healing injuries through focused intention and directed energy. He saw individuals manifesting material abundance, not through hard work in the conventional sense, but through mental and emotional alignment with frequencies of prosperity. He saw human beings communicating telepathically, perceiving energy, altering physical matter through focused consciousness. This can't be real, Tom thought instinctively. This would violate all the laws of physics. It would violate the laws of physics as they've been taught to you, Ilara gently corrected. But your own science is beginning to discover that consciousness and matter aren't separate as you thought. Quantum physics is already showing that observation affects reality, that particles exist in superposition until observed, that everything is interconnected in a web of information and energy. Tom had read enough about quantum physics to know Ilara was right. There were experiments demonstrating bizarre and counterintuitive things about the nature of reality, but he'd always assumed this was only relevant at microscopic scales, not in practical day-to-day applications. Your species has built an artificial division between the quantum world and the classical world, Ilara explained. But that division doesn't really exist. Consciousness operates at quantum levels and can influence physical reality in ways your mainstream science refuses to investigate adequately. Why does it refuse? Tom asked. Because scientists who explore these areas lose funding, have their careers sabotaged, their work rejected by respectable journals, Ilara replied. Not through obvious conspiracy, but through an academic system that rewards conformity and punishes radical innovation. Especially innovation that could empower individuals and make them less dependent on external systems. So, you're saying humans can actually what? Heal themselves through thought, create money through visualization. Tom couldn't keep the skepticism from his mental voice. Let me demonstrate something, Ilara said. You mentioned you take medication for high blood pressure. You also have chronic back pain, don't you? Tom felt a chill. He hadn't mentioned the back pain out loud. How do you know? I can sense it through our connection. And I can sense that this pain has been with you for years, the result of decades of physical labor and chronic emotional tension, Ilara explained. But it doesn't need to be there. Let me show you. Through the telepathic connection, Ilara began guiding Tom through something that seemed impossible. Tom could feel his own attention being directed to the area of pain in his back, not just thinking about it, but literally bringing focused consciousness to that specific location in his body. Feel the energy flowing through that area, Ilara instructed. Don't force anything. Just observe as if you were watching a river flow. Notice where the energy is blocked, where it's stagnant. Tom tried to do what Ilara suggested, feeling ridiculous in the process. But to his surprise, he really could feel something. A kind of heaviness or density in the area of pain, as if energy was trapped there. Now, Ilara continued, visualize that energy beginning to flow again, not through effort, but through gentle intention. Imagine golden light dissolving the blockages, allowing everything to flow naturally again. Tom did as instructed, half expecting nothing to happen. But to his absolute shock, he felt something changing. The pain that was constantly present in his back, a pain that had become so familiar, he barely noticed it consciously most of the time, began to diminish. It didn't disappear completely, but it decreased noticeably, maybe 20 or 30%. What? How did you do that? Tom thought, stunned. I didn't do anything, Ilara replied. You did? I just guided your attention. This is a natural capability all humans possess. Your body is constantly healing itself, constantly reorganizing. But when you bring focused consciousness and loving intention to the process, it accelerates dramatically. Tom moved his torso experimentally. The improvement was undeniable. He could move more easily without the constant tension he normally felt. Will this last? He asked. That depends on you, Ilara said. If you practice this regularly, bringing conscious and loving attention to your body, The improvement will not only last but continue progressing. But if you go back to ignoring your body, carrying emotional tension without releasing it, the pain will eventually return. Tom was struggling to process this decades, believing chronic pain was simply part of aging, something you accepted and managed with medication. And now he was experiencing significant improvement in minutes through what? Focused thought. It's not just thought, Ilara corrected. It's directed consciousness combined with loving intention. And it works because your body isn't separate from your mind. They're aspects of the same consciousness. When you bring loving attention to any part of your being, that part responds positively. Why didn't anyone teach me this? Tom thought, feeling a wave of anger. Why don't doctors teach people to do this instead of just prescribing pills? Because patients who can heal themselves aren't customers who return perpetually, Ilara replied simply. The medical industry profits trillions, treating symptoms chronically. Real healing, especially healing that empowers individuals and makes them independent of external intervention, isn't profitable. Tom felt the anger growing. So, they deliberately keep people sick. Not that simple, Ilara explained. Most doctors genuinely want to help, but they've been trained in a system that focuses exclusively on external intervention, medications, surgeries, technology. Any approach that emphasizes self-healing, lifestyle changes, or the body's innate capabilities is marginalized as unscientific or alternative. But you just showed me it works, Tom protested. Exactly. And there are thousands of studies documenting these capabilities, but those studies are ignored, underfunded, or actively suppressed because they threaten enormously profitable business models. Ilara said Tom was beginning to see the pattern, not just in medicine, but in everything. Systems that profited by keeping people dependent and uninformed about their own capabilities. Let me show you something more, Ilara said, something that will help you understand how manipulation happens at an even more fundamental level. Through the connection, Tom began seeing energy flows again, but this time focused specifically on himself. He could see his own energy, his own field of consciousness, and notice something disturbing. There were like cords or connections emanating from him. Some went toward the TV, others toward piles of bills and financial documents, others toward the phone where he received constant news and updates. What are these connections? Tom asked. They're links of attention and emotional energy, Ilara explained. Every time you watch news that makes you anxious, you feed energy into systems that profit from your anxiety. Every time you worry about debt, you reinforce patterns of scarcity in your consciousness. Every time you consume empty entertainment to escape uncomfortable feelings, you drain energy that could be used for real growth. Tom could see exactly what Ilara meant. He'd spent decades feeding his emotional energy and attention into things that not only didn't serve him, but actively drained him and kept him trapped in patterns of fear and limitation. But how do I turn this off? Tom asked. I still need to know what's happening in the world. I still need to manage my finances. I still need to. You don't need more information, Ilara gently interrupted. You need discernment about what information deserves your attention and emotional energy. You don't need to watch hours of negative news to be informed. You don't need to constantly check your bank balances out of fear to manage finances responsibly. You don't need to consume endless entertainment to relax. So, what do I need? Tom asked. You need to reconnect with your inner source of energy, wisdom, and well-being, Ilara replied. And let me show you how this works practically. Ilara guided Tom through another exercise, this time focusing on gratitude. Think of 3 things you're genuinely grateful for, Ilara instructed. Tom thought his daughter Sarah and the new grandson, the fact that he had a roof over his head and enough food, the beautiful snowy morning he'd seen when he brought Ilara home. Now feel the gratitude, Ilara continued. Don't just think about it, but really feel the emotion of appreciation flowing through your chest. Tom did this, and immediately felt a shift. His energy field, which had felt dense and heavy, began to clear and expand. It was as if gratitude were a solvent, dissolving the density of worry and fear. That's frequency, Ilara explained. Gratitude, love, joy, peace. These emotions vibrate at a much higher frequency than fear, anger, worry, or hopelessness. And when you operate consistently at a higher frequency, several things happen. What things? Tom asked, genuinely curious. First, you naturally become healthier. Your immune system functions better. Your body heals faster. You have more energy, Ilara explained. Second, you begin attracting circumstances and opportunities that match your frequency. Not by magic, but because your perception expands and you act in ways more aligned with positive possibilities. This sounds like that law of attraction thing, Tom said, vaguely remembering hearing about it. The law of attraction is a popular name for real principles of consciousness. Physics are confirmed. Similar frequencies attract and resonate. When you're vibrating at a frequency of scarcity and fear, you literally can't perceive or access opportunities that are vibrating at a frequency of abundance. It's like trying to tune into an FM radio station when your receiver is only set to AM. Tom was beginning to connect the dots. So, all the negative news bombardment, all the programming to feel inadequate, all the constant fear about money and health keeps you vibrating at a low frequency where you're easily controllable and where you can't access your natural capabilities for healing, manifestation, and conscious creation. Ilara completed. It's a self-reinforcing system. People at low frequencies have experiences that confirm their negative worldview, which keeps them at low frequencies. How does someone escape that? Tom asked. Through conscious choice and consistent practice, Ilara replied. You actively choose what you focus your attention on. You practice gratitude daily. You limit exposure to negative programming. You learn to observe your thoughts without identifying with them. You visualize the life you want to experience. You treat your body with love and attention. That sounds too simple, Tom said. Simple, but not easy, Ilara agreed. Because you're going against decades of conditioning, against social pressure, against the inertia of established patterns. But let me demonstrate something that will prove it works. Ilara focused Tom's attention on a specific area of life, his financial situation. You have constant anxiety about money, correct? Always, Tom confirmed. Never seems like enough, because you're focusing on scarcity, which creates more experience of scarcity, Ilara explained. Now, let's do something different. For just 2 minutes, I want you to visualize abundance, not as distant fantasy, but as present reality. Feel what it would be like to wake up without financial anxiety. Visualize checking your bank balance and feeling peace and gratitude for what you see there. Tom tried, though he felt ridiculous in the process. But as he focused on the feeling of abundance, he noticed something extraordinary. The constant tension he carried in his chest, a tension that had become so familiar he barely noticed it, began to relax. For a brief moment, he actually felt what it would be like to live without constant financial anxiety. This is just feeling good temporarily, Tom protested. It doesn't change the actual balance in my bank account. Not immediately, Ilara agreed. But it changes your frequency, which changes your perception and your actions. You'll begin noticing opportunities that were always there, but you didn't see. You'll make different decisions. You'll attract different circumstances, not overnight, but consistently over time. Can you prove this? Tom asked. Only through your own experience, Ilara replied. And that's exactly why these practices have been suppressed and ridiculed, because they can only be validated through personal experience. You can't learn this theoretically. You have to live it. Tom felt something shifting inside him. Not just his understanding, but his determination. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he felt something like real hope. Not passive hope that things would magically improve, but active hope based on recognizing he had power to change his experience. There's one last thing I need to show you, Ilara said. The most important evidence of all, and what Tom saw next would remove any remaining doubt about the true potential that had been dormant inside him his entire life. Through the telepathic connection, Ilara directed Tom's attention to something he'd never considered before. The fundamental nature of his own thoughts. You believe your thoughts are just reactions to external circumstances, Ilara began. You think you're worried because you have real problems, that you're anxious because the world is threatening, that you're limited because your circumstances are limiting. But the truth is exactly the opposite. Tom felt immediate resistance. My problems are real. Bills are real. Physical pain is real. They're not just thoughts. Watch carefully, Elara said. And suddenly, Tom could see his own thought patterns, as if they were visible objects floating around him. They were like loops, repetitive thoughts, constantly circling. I don't have enough money. I'm getting old. Life is hard. I'm not good enough. The world is getting worse. Nothing ever changes. These thoughts circle through your mind dozens, maybe hundreds of times a day, Elara explained. And each time they circle, they reinforce a specific frequency of consciousness. They literally program your reality. But I don't choose to think these things, Tom protested. They just appear. Exactly, Elara said. They've been programmed into you over decades. Through experiences, yes, but also through constant messages from media, advertising, educational systems, authorities. You were taught to think this way, and now these patterns run automatically, like software running in the background. Tom observed the thought loops with growing horror and recognition. Elara was right. He thought these things constantly, so frequently they'd become the background noise of his existence. But here's the crucial part, Elara continued. These thoughts aren't you. You're the consciousness, observing the thoughts. And once you realize that, you can begin consciously choosing which thoughts to feed and which to let pass. How? Tom asked. Let me show you, Elara said. Right now, while we're connected, bring to mind your biggest financial worry. Tom thought about the bills he needed to pay next month, the familiar anxiety about not having enough. Immediately he felt his energy field contract, becoming dense and heavy. Feel that? Elara asked. Your frequency just dropped dramatically. Now intentionally choose a different thought. Think. I've always been taken care of. Solutions always appear. I'm grateful for the abundance I already have. Tom tried, feeling artificial and forced at first. But as he held those thoughts, something extraordinary happened. His energy field began expanding again, clearing. The feeling of contraction and fear was replaced by something lighter and more open. This is just pretending, Tom protested. I still have the same bills, but your frequency has changed, Elara pointed out. And at this new frequency, you'll be able to perceive and access solutions that were invisible at the fear frequency. Plus, you're no longer feeding energy into scarcity, which means you stop creating more scarcity. You're saying my thoughts literally create my reality? Tom asked, skepticism still present in his mental voice. I'm saying your consistent thoughts create your consciousness frequency, and your frequency determines what you can perceive and experience, Elara explained. That's why people who consistently focus on problems experience more problems. Not because the universe is punishing them, but because they're tuned to a frequency where problems are what they perceive and create. Elara shifted focus, showing Tom something even deeper. Now see this. Observe how your thoughts about your daughter affect you. Tom thought of Sarah and immediately felt a wave of worry. Her working too hard, drowning in debt, exhausted, trapped in the same cycle he'd lived. Feel how this drains you? Elara asked. Your worry doesn't help Sarah. In fact, you're energetically reinforcing her struggle narrative. Now, shift the thought. Visualize Sarah thriving, finding solutions, living with joy and ease. Tom tried, and again felt a dramatic shift. Instead of heavy worry, he felt something more like hope and confidence. When you hold this higher vision for someone, Elara explained, you energetically offer them a different frequency to tune into. It doesn't guarantee they'll choose it, but it creates possibility. Worry closes possibilities. Confident vision opens possibilities. Tom was beginning to see how deeply he'd been programmed to operate from low frequencies. Worry was considered responsible love. Fear was considered prudent realism. Limiting expectations was considered mature wisdom. But all of this was just ways to maintain low frequency. Now comes the most important part, Elara said, his mental voice taking on a more serious tone. I want you to understand who really benefits from keeping you at this low frequency. The images returned. Those webs of energy Tom had seen before, connecting power systems to masses of people. But now, Elara was showing something more specific. See how it works, Elara explained. Governments need fearful people to justify control. Media profits from attention. And fear generates more attention than hope. Corporations sell products promising to fill emotional voids. Financial systems profit by keeping people in debt. The pharmaceutical industry profits by keeping people chronically sick. Politicians gain power by promising protection from threats. Tom saw specific connections. How news constantly played up fear of crime, justifying more policing and surveillance. How advertising constantly reinforced inadequacy, driving toward products. How medical systems focused on symptom management instead of real healing. How education created obedient workers instead of creative thinkers. But it's not just external systems, Elara continued. There are also what you might call entities or forces that literally feed on low-frequency emotional energy. What? Tom thought, alarmed. Consciousness exists in many forms and dimensions, Elara explained. There are forms of non-physical consciousness that feed on certain emotional frequencies, particularly fear, anger, despair. They're not necessarily evil in the way you understand it, but they are parasitic, and they have an interest in keeping your species generating those frequencies. You're talking about demons? Negative entities? Tom asked, feeling a chill. Call them what you want, Elara said. The important point is, there are layers of manipulation. Visible physical systems are just one part. There are also energetic and interdimensional influences, keeping your species at a frequency that feeds these forms of consciousness. Tom felt a wave of anger and hopelessness. So, we're completely trapped. Physical systems manipulating us, energetic entities feeding on us. How does anyone escape that? Through exactly what I'm showing you, Elara replied calmly. When you consistently raise your frequency, you literally become invisible and inaccessible to these low-frequency forces. Love, gratitude, joy, peace. These frequencies are toxic to parasitic entities. They can't feed on them. So, the solution is just be happy, Tom asked, incredulous. The solution is to reclaim your sovereignty as a conscious creator, Elara corrected. Understand that you're not a victim of external forces. You're a consciousness antenna that can choose which frequency it operates on. And your frequency determines your experiential reality. Elara showed Tom a final demonstration, a vision of two possible versions of his own future life. In one version, Tom continued as he was watching news, constantly worrying, taking piles of medications, living his remaining years in quiet frustration until dying of some stress-related disease. In the other version, Tom consciously practiced frequency elevation, daily gratitude, positive visualization, limiting exposure to negative programming, loving attention to his body. In this version, his health improved dramatically. Unexpected financial opportunities appeared, relationships deepened, and he lived his remaining years with purpose, joy, and genuine contribution. The difference between these two timelines, Elara explained, isn't luck. It's not fate. It's choice. Specifically, choice about where you focus attention and what frequency you cultivate through your habitual thoughts and emotions. Tom observed the two versions of his future with a mixture of hope and lingering skepticism. But what if I try this, and it doesn't work? What if I practice gratitude and visualization, and nothing changes? Then you weren't really practicing, Elara responded without judgment. You were just performing superficial actions while maintaining frequencies of doubt and fear. Real change requires genuine commitment. Not blind and naive, but conscious and consistent. How long does it take? Tom asked. For initial improvements, days or weeks, Elara said. For deep transformation, months. To fully live from a new frequency, years of consistent practice. But each step improves experience immediately. It's not sacrifice that eventually pays off. It's investment that returns dividends from the start. Tom felt something solid forming in his chest. Determination mixed with cautious hope. And you're saying if enough people do this, entire control systems begin to crumble. Not crumble violently, are incorrected, but become irrelevant? Control systems only have power over people operating at low frequencies. When individuals awaken to their own creative power, they naturally stop participating in systems that don't serve them. And those systems, without energy feeding them, gradually transform or dissolve. So, it's not about revolution. It's about evolution, Tom said, beginning to understand. Exactly, Ilara confirmed. Revolution comes from anger, which is low frequency. Evolution comes from expanded consciousness, which is high frequency. Your species doesn't need to overthrow systems. You need to outgrow them. Tom felt the telepathic connection beginning to weaken naturally, as if the amount of information that could be transmitted in a single session had reached its limit. There's so much more to share, Ilara said, but you need to integrate what you've already received. Your human brain needs to process. Your consciousness needs to gradually expand to accommodate new understandings. When are you leaving? Tom asked, feeling surprised to realize he no longer wanted Ilara to go. Soon, Ilara replied. My injury is healed enough. I can call my species for rescue. But before I leave, I'll make sure you understand not just what I've shown you, but how to apply it in daily life, because understanding without application is useless. And Tom, finally ready to not just listen, but truly change, agreed to learn what would be necessary to live from a completely new frequency. In the days following that deep telepathic connection, Ilara began teaching Tom specific practices he could use to maintain and elevate his consciousness frequency after the extraterrestrial visitor departed. Intellectual understanding isn't enough, Ilara explained during one of their conversations in the shed. They could now communicate telepathically without constant physical contact. The initial connection had created a kind of channel that remained partially open. You need daily practices that reprogram your automatic patterns of thought and emotion. Tom sat in the work chair, a mug of coffee in his hands, giving his full attention. At first, he'd felt ridiculous learning what Ilara called consciousness hygiene. But the tangible results he was already experiencing, less back pain, more energy, reduced anxiety, were impossible to deny. The first practice is active gratitude, Ilara began. Every day, right when you wake up, before your mind starts with automatic worries, you mentally list at least 5 things you're genuinely grateful for. Don't just think about them. Feel the emotion of appreciation. Why, right when I wake up? Tom asked. Because that's when you program the frequency for the entire day, Ilara explained. If your first thought upon waking is worry about bills or problems, you start the day at a low frequency and everything you experience will be filtered through that frequency. But if you begin with genuine gratitude, you establish a higher frequency as your baseline. Tom had started experimenting with this over the past few days. It was surprising how difficult it was at first. His mind wanted to immediately jump to worries and problems. But when he managed to focus on gratitude for just a few minutes, the entire tone of the day changed. The second practice is creative visualization, Ilara continued. Not as escapist fantasy, but as conscious programming of reality. You spend a few minutes a day visualizing your life as you want to experience it, not in the distant future, but as if it's already present reality. Isn't that just pretending? Tom asked. Your brain doesn't clearly distinguish between vividly imagined experience and real experience, Ilara explained. When you consistently visualize health, your body begins reorganizing toward that pattern. When you visualize abundance, your mind begins perceiving opportunities that were previously invisible. You're literally retraining your perception and response system. Tom thought about this. It made sense in a way. Athletes used visualization to improve performance. Why couldn't it work for other aspects of life? The third practice is negativity, fasting. Ilara said you need to drastically reduce exposure to low-frequency programming. That means severely limiting news consumption, eliminating or drastically reducing television, being selective about conversations you participate in. But I can't just ignore what's happening in the world, Tom protested, though he recognized he was repeating the same argument he'd used before. You're not ignoring, you're choosing to discern, Ilara corrected. You can stay informed about important issues without absorbing constant bombardment of negativity. 15 minutes of selective reading per day is enough to be genuinely informed. 3 hours watching emotionally charged news isn't informing yourself. It's fear programming. Tom knew Ilara was right. He'd started experimenting with limiting his news exposure, and the difference was dramatic. Without the constant stream of tragedies and crises, his baseline anxiety had decreased significantly. The fourth practice is loving body attention, Ilara explained. A few minutes a day focusing consciousness on your body with intention of love and healing, the same way we did with your back pain. Your body is constantly communicating with you, but you've learned to ignore it until problems become crises. How do I do this practically? Tom asked. Sit quietly, breathe deeply, and bring gentle attention to different parts of your body, Ilara instructed. Not judging, not trying to fix anything, just observing and sending appreciation. Thank your heart for beating without you having to think about it. Thank your lungs for breathing. Thank your hands for everything they do. This creates a completely different relationship with your body. Tom had tried this once, and was surprised to realize how disconnected he was from his own body. He treated it like a machine that should function, getting irritated when it hurt or malfunctioned. The idea of having a relationship of gratitude and communication with his own body was completely new. The fifth practice is observation meditation, Ilara continued. Even just 5 minutes a day, sitting quietly and observing your thoughts without identifying with them. You realize that thoughts come and go like clouds in the sky, but you're the sky, not the clouds. I've tried meditating before, Tom said. Could never get my mind to be quiet. Because that's not the goal, Ilara explained. The goal isn't to stop thoughts. It's to stop believing you are your thoughts. When you can observe a thought like, I don't have enough money, without immediately believing it and reacting emotionally, you've gained sovereignty over your own consciousness. Tom was beginning to see how these practices work together to create something greater than the sum of the parts. They weren't isolated tricks, but an integrated system of consciousness reprogramming. But here's the most important part, Ilara said, his mental voice carrying special emphasis. You need to understand that you don't have a special mission. You weren't chosen to save the world or awaken other people. You're not the protagonist of some cosmic story. Tom felt a mixture of relief and disappointment at this information. So why show me all this? Because you were ready, Ilara replied simply. Not special, not chosen, just ready. There are millions of people on your planet who are in the same state of readiness. Some will find teachers like me. Others will have awakening experiences through personal crisis. Others will simply start questioning and seeking on their own. So what's my role? Tom asked. To be yourself operating at a higher frequency, Ilara said. That's all. You don't need to preach, teach, or convince anyone. You simply practice these things, live from an elevated frequency, and allow your own transformation to be the demonstration. How does that help anyone? Tom asked, feeling like he should be more active, more missionary. Frequencies naturally propagate, Ilara explained. When you're vibrating at a frequency of peace, love, and trust, you literally affect the consciousness field around you. People nearby will feel it, even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. Some will be drawn and ask questions. Others will simply feel an opening in their own possibilities. So, it's more about being than doing, Tom asked. Exactly. And that's much harder than noisy activism, Ilara said. Because it requires daily consistency and practices nobody sees. It requires maintaining elevated frequency, even when circumstances try to pull you down. It requires having faith that subtle transformation is more powerful than dramatic. Tom thought about Sarah, his daughter. What about people close to me who are clearly suffering? Shouldn't I try to help them wake up? You can share when they ask, Ilara said. But unsolicited evangelizing rarely works. People need to reach their own crises that open them to questioning reality. Your task with Sarah is simply to hold a high vision of her. See her as capable, as finding solutions, as thriving, not as a victim who needs saving. That seems just passive, Tom said. It seems passive to the ego that wants to be a hero. Arin gently corrected. But it's extremely active, energetically. Maintaining high frequency when everything around you is pulling downward requires tremendous strength, and you'll be helping more by holding that frequency than by descending to a frequency of worry and trying to fix people. Tom was beginning to understand it wasn't about becoming some guru or leader. It was about silent and consistent transformation that would create ripples through natural connections. What about the systems you showed me? Tom asked. The governments, corporations, media, all designed to keep us at low frequencies. Shouldn't we fight against them? Fighting is low frequency, Ain replied. What you resist persists because resistance requires you to focus attention and emotional energy on what you don't want. Instead, you simply stop feeding those systems with your energy. How? Tom asked. You stop watching programming that makes you afraid or angry. You stop buying products based on feeling inadequate. You stop voting out of fear of others. You stop depending on medical systems for every little problem. You stop working jobs you hate just for false security. Ain explained. When enough people do this, systems that depend on fear-based participation naturally transform or die. But I can't just stop working or using modern medicine completely, Tom protested. It doesn't need to be extreme, Arun assured. It's about gradual shift in relationship. You use systems when they genuinely serve you, but stop letting them control you through fear. You work because you choose to contribute, not because you're terrified of poverty. You use medicine when necessary, but also develop natural healing capabilities. It's gradual transition from dependence to sovereignty. Tom was absorbing all this, feeling a fundamental shift happening, not just in his understanding, but in his own presence. He could feel that he was beginning to vibrate differently, that something essential had changed. One last crucial thing, Ilara said. You'll face doubt constantly. Part of you will question whether all this is real, whether it works, whether it's not just fantasy. That doubt is normal. Don't fight it. Just observe it and keep practicing. How do I deal with the doubt? Tom asked. Through empirical experimentation, Ilara replied. You don't need to believe blindly. You treat it as an experiment. Practice consistently for 30 days and observe results. If your life improves, health, opportunities, peace of mind, then you have evidence. If nothing changes, then you can discard it as non-functional. But you need to actually practice, not just think about. Practicing. Tom nodded. This made sense to his practical mind. It wasn't about blind faith, but about testing through real experience. And remember, Ilara added, transformation isn't linear. There will be days when you fall back into old patterns. That's normal and expected. What matters is gentle and consistent redirection over time. You're undoing decades of programming. Be patient with yourself. Tom felt deep gratitude for this being who had literally fallen from the sky into his life and shared things Tom would never have discovered on his own. But he also felt growing sadness, realizing Ilara would be leaving soon. Will you come back someday? Tom asked. Maybe, Ilara replied. But you won't need me. Everything you need is already inside you. I just helped you remember. And with those words, Tom began his journey of living no longer as a victim of circumstances, but as a conscious creator of his own experience. Ilara left on a cold January morning, exactly 1 week after Tom had found him in that snowy field. A luminous signal in the sky, invisible to the naked eye, but which Ilara had activated telepathically, brought a small craft that landed silently behind the shed before dawn. Tom watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of wonder and sadness as his extraterrestrial visitor disappeared into the sky. But Ilara had left something permanent, not a physical object, but an understanding Tom would carry for the rest of his life. In the first days after Ilara's departure, Tom felt strangely alone. Not the familiar loneliness that had become his constant companion in the years since the divorce, but a different loneliness, that of someone who had seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality and now had to live in this new understanding without a guide. But he promised himself he would practice. So that's what he did. The first change Tom noticed was in the quality of his mornings. For decades, waking up had been an act of dragging himself out of bed, his first thought invariably being about something worrying, bills, health, loneliness. But now, before even fully opening his eyes, he practiced the gratitude exercise Ilara had taught him. I'm grateful I woke up healthy enough to get up. I'm grateful I have a roof over my head. I'm grateful for the coffee I'm about to make. I'm grateful for my grandson. I'm grateful for the sun rising. At first, it felt mechanical, forced, but Tom persisted, and after about a week, something shifted. The gratitude began to feel genuine, and with it came a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The second change was his relationship with news. Tom had been a faithful news consumer, watching the morning broadcast over coffee, checking headlines online several times a day, watching the evening news before bed. He justified it as staying informed, but Alara had shown it was more programming than information. Tom decided to run an experiment. For 1 week, he'd cut out traditional news completely. If something truly important happened, he trusted he'd find out other ways. The first few days were surprisingly difficult. He found himself automatically reaching for the remote in the morning, his finger hovering over the power button. He felt a strange anxiety, as if he was missing something crucial. But he resisted. On the 4th day, Tom noticed something extraordinary. The constant tension in his shoulders, so familiar he barely consciously perceived it, had decreased significantly. He wasn't waking up with a sense of dread about the state of the world. His baseline irritability, which he'd always attributed just to aging, had diminished. On the 7th day, he realized he hadn't missed anything important at all. No crucial information had escaped him, but he'd gained something precious. Mental peace and energy that had previously been drained by worries about things he couldn't control. Tom decided to extend the experiment indefinitely, allowing himself only 15 minutes of selective news reading per day, focusing on sources that presented information without excessive emotional dramatization. The 3rd change involved his body. Tom had neglected his body for decades, treating it like a machine that should function without maintenance. When it hurt, he took pills. When he was tired, he pushed through with coffee. When he was tense, he ignored it until it became chronic pain. Now, following Alara's guidance, Tom began practicing what he called body check-ins. Every day, usually in the morning after gratitude and before getting up, he spent 5 minutes simply paying attention to his body. He brought awareness to different areas: feet, legs, back, shoulders, neck, head, not trying to fix anything, just observing with gentle curiosity, and always sending gratitude and appreciation. Thank you, feet, for carrying me. Thank you, hands, for everything they do. Thank you, heart, for beating without me having to remind you. The results were surprising. The chronic back pain that Alara had helped diminish continued improving. It didn't disappear completely, but reduced to maybe 20% of what it used to be. Tom discovered that when he brought loving attention to areas of tension, they naturally began to relax. Even more impressive, his blood pressure began dropping. At his monthly doctor's appointment, his physician was visibly surprised. "I don't know what you're doing, Tom, but keep it up. Your numbers are the best I've seen in years." Tom smiled but didn't explain. How could he explain that he was healing his body through conscious attention and gratitude? His doctor would think he was crazy. The 4th change was financial, and this was the most surprising to Tom because it involved tangible external results that couldn't be explained just by a shift in perspective. Tom had begun practicing the exercise Alara had shown him, visualizing abundance as present reality instead of future fantasy. Every day, for just 5 minutes, he sat quietly and felt what it would be like to wake up without financial anxiety. He visualized checking his bank balance and feeling peace and gratitude for what he saw there. At first, it seemed absurd and pointless. His actual bills didn't change just because he imagined abundance. But Tom had promised to experiment for 30 days, so he continued. In the 2nd week, something strange happened. A neighbor Tom barely knew stopped by, asking if he still did mechanic work. His truck had broken down, and he didn't want to pay the prices at the shop in town. Tom agreed to take a look, found it was a simple repair, and charged a fair price. The neighbor was so grateful he mentioned Tom to other friends. Within days, Tom had 3 additional customers. It wasn't a fortune, but it was significant extra income that appeared out of nowhere. In the 3rd week, Tom was organizing some things in the shed and found an old tool he'd completely forgotten about, a rare torque wrench from a brand that didn't manufacture anymore. Out of curiosity, he checked online and discovered collectors paid surprisingly high prices for it. In the 4th week, Tom received a letter informing him that a distant relative he barely remembered had passed away and left a small inheritance. It wasn't a life-changing amount, but it was enough to cover his immediate financial worries. Tom couldn't logically explain how or why these opportunities had appeared exactly when he began practicing abundance visualization. Coincidence? Maybe, but there were too many coincidences happening since he'd changed his consciousness frequency. The fifth change was in relationships, and this was perhaps the most subtle, but most profound. Tom had grown accustomed to superficial social interactions, polite greetings, complaints about weather or politics, conversations that went nowhere. He felt disconnected from most people, as if he was living behind invisible glass. But as his frequency changed, his interactions began changing, too. The first time he noticed was at the grocery store. The cashier, a middle-aged woman who always seemed tired and irritable, suddenly smiled genuinely at him when he greeted her. "You seem different today," she'd commented. "More light somehow." Tom had smiled back, feeling real human connection for the first time in months of shopping at that same location. This began happening more frequently. Casual conversations with strangers naturally deepened. People started sharing personal things with him for no apparent reason. Not because he was doing anything different externally, but because something in his energy had changed. The real test came when Sarah visited with the baby a few weeks after Ilara's departure. Tom was nervous about the encounter, remembering the last time when he'd seen his daughter so exhausted and hopeless. But this time, instead of falling into worry about her, Tom practiced what Ilara had taught. Holding a high vision, he visualized Sarah finding solutions, thriving, living with more ease. He sent love and confidence toward her energetically instead of worry and attempts to fix. During the visit, Sarah seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months. She still had the same challenges, demanding work, debt, exhaustion of motherhood, but seemed to be handling them differently. "Dad, you're different," she'd commented while they drank coffee in the kitchen. "I can't explain it, but you seem more present, more at peace." Tom had smiled. "I found some answers I was looking for." "What kind of answers?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Tom considered for a moment how to respond. He could try to explain about Orin, about consciousness frequencies, about control systems. But he knew instinctively it would be too much, too strange, and probably counterproductive. "Answers about what really matters," he said simply. "About focusing on what I can control instead of worrying about what I can't. About gratitude for the good things instead of only seeing problems." Sarah had looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe I need some of those answers too." "You'll find them when you're ready," Tom had responded, and left it at that. He didn't try to convince her, didn't try to teach, didn't try to save her from her struggles. He just held the high vision and trusted she'd find her own path in the right time. After 2 months of consistent practice, Tom realized he was living a fundamentally different life. Not because his external circumstances had changed dramatically. He still lived in the same house, had the same retirement income, faced many of the same practical challenges, but the quality of his experience was completely different. He woke up with gratitude instead of dread. He saw opportunities where he'd previously seen only problems. He felt connection where he'd felt isolation. He had energy where he'd had exhaustion. He experienced peace where he'd had constant anxiety. And most importantly, he'd stopped feeling like a victim. There were still control systems, still challenges, still difficulties, but he no longer felt powerless before them. He'd reclaimed his sovereignty as a conscious creator of his own experience. Ilara had promised transformation was possible, and Tom now had empirical evidence in his own life. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply the natural result of consistently operating at a higher frequency of consciousness. And that, Tom realized, was just the beginning. 3 months after Ilara's departure, Tom sat in his workshop on an April afternoon, watching the snow finally melting and revealing the first green grass of spring. He had a coffee mug in his hands and an open notebook on his lap, something he'd started keeping to record his observations and reflections on the journey he was living. The transformation he'd experienced was undeniable. His life hadn't become perfect. There were still bills to pay, still challenges to face, still difficult days. But the fundamental quality of his experience had changed in ways he never could have imagined possible. Most remarkable was the absence of chronic anxiety that had been his constant companion for decades. Not that he never worried, but worry no longer dominated him. He could observe worrying thoughts arising, acknowledge them, and choose not to feed them with emotional energy. Tom had developed what Ilara would call intuitive navigation, a growing ability to make decisions based on inner wisdom rather than just fear or external logic. It started with small things and gradually expanded to bigger choices. A few weeks ago, he'd had a strong intuition to call Sarah at a random moment during the day. When he called, he discovered she was having a particularly rough day and desperately needed someone to talk to. If he'd ignored the intuition, he would have missed that opportunity for connection. Another example, Tom had felt an inexplicable urge to organize his workshop on a specific Saturday. While doing so, a neighbor stopped by and casually mentioned needing help with a construction project. That turned into 3 weeks of well-paid work that Tom never would have gotten if he hadn't been in the right place at the right time. They were small synchronicities, but they happened frequently enough that Tom could no longer dismiss them as mere coincidence. It was as if the universe was responding to his new frequency of consciousness with opportunities and connections that were previously invisible to him. His health continued improving in ways that surprised even his doctor. He'd managed to reduce his blood pressure medication by 50%, with plans to eliminate it completely if the trend continued. The chronic back pain was now just an occasional reminder instead of a constant presence. He had more energy at 61 than he'd had at 50. "How are you doing this?" his doctor had asked during the last appointment. "Lifestyle changes," Tom had answered vaguely. "Less stress, more gratitude, better connection with my body." The doctor had looked skeptical, but couldn't argue with the results. Tom smiled to himself, remembering the doctor's confused expression. How could he explain that he was healing his body through practices that conventional medicine considered unscientific? But perhaps the most profound aspect of Tom's transformation was internal, a fundamental shift in how he saw himself and his place in the world. For decades, Tom had seen himself as essentially powerless. Things happened to him, and he reacted as best he could. Governments made laws, the economy fluctuated, his body aged, circumstances changed, and he was just a passenger trying to survive it all. Now he understood something completely different. He wasn't a victim of external circumstances. He was a field of consciousness, capable of influencing his experience through where he focused attention and what frequency he cultivated through thoughts and emotions. This didn't mean he could control everything that happened in his life, but it meant he had tremendous power over how he experienced what happened. And that shift in perspective from victim to conscious creator had literally changed everything. Tom began noticing other people who seemed to be operating from similar frequencies. There was a quality of presence, a depth in the eyes, an inner peace he could recognize now. Not many people, maybe 1 in 20, 1 in 30, but they were there. Sometimes he'd exchange glances with these people, and there was a silent, mutual recognition. They knew about frequencies, about inner power, about the illusion of external control, and they didn't need to talk about it to share that understanding. It made him think about what Ilara had said about collective awakening. How many people around the world were going through similar transformations? How many were questioning the official narrative of reality, experimenting with consciousness practices, discovering their own power? Tom didn't have numbers, but he had an intuitive sense that it was more than most people imagined. A silent movement of awakening happening not through loud revolution, but through quiet individual transformation. He also began questioning the role of technology in this awakening. Ilara had shown how systems use technology to control and manipulate, but Tom also saw how the internet was connecting people around the world who were exploring similar concepts. He'd started researching online and found communities of people discussing consciousness, vibrational frequency, manifestation, energy healing. There were scientists doing legitimate research on these topics, even though mainstream science marginalized them. Maybe Tom thought the same technology that was used to control can also be used to liberate. It depends on how we choose to use it. One of the questions that most intrigued Tom was about timing. Why now? Why was humanity going through this awakening at this specific moment in history? He'd begun to perceive that many of the crises dominating the news, climate change, economic instability, political polarization, growing mental health issues, could be symptoms of old systems that no longer worked as human consciousness evolved. Perhaps the apparent intensification of problems wasn't evidence that the world was getting worse, but evidence that humanity was being forced to find solutions from a higher level of consciousness. Problems that couldn't be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. As someone famous had once said, this raised another question. What was Tom's role in this larger transformation? Elara had been clear that he didn't have a special mission, wasn't chosen, but he'd also said that each person operating at an elevated frequency contributed to the collective awakening simply through their presence. Tom was beginning to understand this more deeply. It wasn't about evangelizing or convincing people. It was about living authentically from an elevated frequency and allowing that to create natural waves of influence. He was already seeing it happen. Sarah had started asking questions about his practices. Some neighbors commented on how different he seemed and asked what had changed. He never forced it, never preached, just shared when genuinely asked. And there was something more subtle happening too. Tom noticed that when he was at an elevated frequency, centered, grateful, at peace, the interactions around him seemed to flow more smoothly. Conversations were more productive, problems resolved more easily. It was as if his frequency created a field that affected everyone around him. But Tom was also aware that there was still much he didn't understand. Elara's revelations had opened doors, but they'd also revealed how vast the unexplored territory was. How exactly did manifestation work? Why did some visualizations seem to materialize quickly while others took longer or didn't happen? Were there principles or laws governing this that he still didn't fully understand? And what about the entities or forces Elara had mentioned? Those non-physical consciousnesses that supposedly fed on low-frequency emotional energy. Tom had never experienced anything he could definitively identify as this, but he also couldn't rule out the possibility. There was also the question of how far human capabilities really went. Elara had suggested that humans had potential far beyond what they currently manifested. Tom had experienced healing through consciousness, manifestation through frequency, intuition through inner connection. But what else was possible? Telepathy. He and Elara had communicated telepathically, but Tom hadn't yet developed this ability with other humans. Maybe it was possible with practice and development. Direct influence over physical matter. Elara had demonstrated the ability to affect plants and objects through focused intention. Did humans have this latent capability, perception of other dimensions or realities? Elara had shown layers of reality that were normally invisible. Could Tom develop the ability to perceive these layers naturally? These questions didn't torment him. On the contrary, they inspired him because they represented possibilities, not limitations. They represented a journey of continuous discovery instead of a final destination. Tom also wondered about humanity's collective future if enough people awakened to their true potential. What would the world look like? Would fear-based control systems really dissolve, as Elara had suggested? Or would there be resistance, conflict, a chaotic transition period? He didn't have answers, but he had hope. Not passive hope that things would magically improve, but active hope based on knowing that each individual had the power to change their own experience and influence the collective field. One afternoon, while Tom was working on a project in the workshop, Sarah called unexpectedly. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying a different quality. Not the usual exhaustion, but something lighter. Something weird happened. "Remember when you said you'd found answers about gratitude and focusing on what matters?" "Yes," Tom responded cautiously. "I started experimenting with it. Just trying to be grateful for small things, you know. And I swear, Dad, things started to change. I got a promotion I didn't even know was possible. The baby started sleeping better. Robert and I fight less. I don't know if it's coincidence," or Tom smiled. "It's not coincidence, sweetheart. Keep practicing. It'll get even better." After hanging up, Tom felt a wave of deep gratitude, not just for the changes in his own life, but for witnessing the awakening beginning in his daughter. He hadn't preached, hadn't forced, just lived his truth and let her make her own discoveries in the right time. This, he realized, was how real transformation happened. Not through violent revolution or aggressive evangelism, but through individuals quietly elevating their frequencies and naturally radiating that change to the world around them. Tom looked through the workshop window at the green spring fields. Somewhere out there, probably very far away now, Elara was living his own life, perhaps observing other species on other worlds going through their own awakenings. Tom wondered if he'd see Elara again someday. Part of him hoped so, but another part knew it didn't matter. because everything Alara had come to teach was already integrated into who Tom had become, and Tom knew with a certainty that came from the deepest part of his being that his journey was just beginning. There was still so much to explore, so much to understand, so much unrealized potential. But unlike before, when his life seemed to be ending before it had really begun, now Tom felt he was finally at 61, beginning to truly live. He had woken up and he would never go back to sleep. Tom's story reveals a powerful truth to us. Yes, there is a system designed to keep us in fear, scarcity, and disease. But the most important news isn't about who controls us. It's about the power we have to change it. Your thinking creates your reality, not as an abstract theory, but as a real and measurable force. Every thought you hold, every emotion you cultivate, every frequency you vibrate at is literally shaping your life experience. Tom was trapped for decades, working hard, always worried, always sick, never having enough. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he was vibrating at the frequency the system wants you to vibrate at. The frequency of fear, of scarcity, of dependence. When he changed his frequency, everything changed. Not magically, but naturally and consistently. You can do this, too. Daily gratitude. Conscious visualization of what you want to experience, limiting exposure to negative programming, loving attention to your body. Focus on abundance instead of scarcity. They're simple practices, but immensely powerful because they reconnect you with your true nature. You're not a victim waiting to be saved. You're a conscious creator with extraordinary capabilities. If this message resonated with you, leave in the comments. Are you ready to awaken and claim your power as the creator of your own reality? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because more people need to know this truth. You have the power. You always have. It's just time to remember.